let's talk about population first. With a definition, a population is a set of every person, place, animal, or thing, whatever it is we're studying. All right, so every person, place, animal, or thing we would want to collect data on if we could. It is who or what we want the results of the study to generalize to. That means apply to. All right. So don't worry. I always give examples. Right. So if you hear a definition and you're like, I don't know what she just said, well, that's okay, because I am going to give you examples. Okay. So let's just take this apart a little bit first. Okay. So every person, place, thing, etc. We're studying something. We're collecting data on something. As psychologists or behavioral scientists, what we are collecting data on is usually data from humans, but often from animals, right? Because behavioral scientists, we do a lot of research on rats and mice and sometimes dogs and rabbits and snakes and cockroaches and who knows what. So it's not always that we're going to be studying people, but maybe we're studying population density. Oh, well, that's kind of sort of people. So let me give you another example. Maybe we're studying, let's see, plants. We could be studying plants. We could be studying bacteria growing in a Petri dish. I don't know why we would do this, but maybe we're studying chairs in a classroom. Who knows what we're studying, right? So that's why I have to define it very, very globally, right? So you're studying a population if you have included every single person, every single rat, every single dog, etc. So if you only have a subset of dogs or people or whatever, then you don't have a population. The population must include every single one, all right? Every single thing. Now, the next part of the definition says that we want to include everybody that we would want to collect data on if we could. Now, what this is telling you, and what I will explain, is that we actually, as researchers, we define ourselves who it is we want to study, who it is we want to be able to say these results apply to, and then finish the sentence. Okay, it's the researcher that defines that. Okay, let me do an example here, and this will help you understand. So, I thought an example was going to pop up and not this. So just we'll come back to this little sentence here. Don't bother reading it. Okay, so let's say that I'm a researcher and I want to do a study, and I want to study all humans. I really want my research to apply to all humans, every single human. Well, if I define my population as all humans, that's going to be extremely, and that even the word extremely does not do it justice. Extremely large. It's huge. It's gigantic. It's more than gigantic times 10, right? The human population is so large. But I could, in theory, I could say that's my population. I want my research to apply to all humans. Well, let's say I want to narrow it down a little bit. Maybe I'm not interested in all humans. And so maybe really what I want my results to apply to, or my study to apply to, is just female humans. I'm only interested in the XX, not the XY. And maybe there's a good reason for that. Maybe I'm doing research on hormones, specifically those hormones, female hormones that are typically found in females pre and post menopause. And in fact, maybe I'm not interested in premenopausal female humans. Maybe I'm only interested in postmenopausal humans, female humans. Now, do you see how this population, how I've defined it, is going to be smaller than this one, female humans, and that's going to be smaller than the first one where I said I'm interested in all humans. And you should begin to understand now what this is saying. It says the more criteria you add for who or what is to be included in the population, which you define, the smaller your population will be. So if I define my population as human, that's only one criteria, that's going to be immense. If I add another criteria and say, no, they have to be female human, with those two criteria, well, guess what? I've pretty much halved the population size, right? It's now going to be half as big because I'm eliminating all the male humans, all right? And then if I add a third criteria, all right, female human postmenopausal, I'm making my population even smaller. And if I add yet another criteria, what's going to happen? I'm going to make it even smaller still. So female, human, postmenopausal, never been pregnant. Maybe that's the population. I'm not interested in anybody else. I'm going to do a study. I define my population with those criteria. Anybody who does not meet those criteria is not part of my population, and that's because I'm not interested in them. Okay, so do you see how this works? So some main takeaways here are that to study a population means you've included every single person in your study. So unless you define your population very, very narrowly by including lots of criteria, chances are you're not ever going to be able to study the entire population. So that's one thing I wanted to say about a population. It's a set of everything that you would want to study if you could. The other thing is we define the population ourselves as researchers. If you're a researcher, I'm going to say, well, you tell me, who's your population? What are your criteria for inclusion in the population? That's going to define it for you. Okay, so what are the criteria? And the other is, as we add more criteria, we shrink the size of the population we're interested in. All right, so populations can be huge, they can be immense, but they can also be really, really, really small. If you've got, 1,000 criteria for being included in your population, you might have a very, very, very small population. So populations can be any size, big or small. Right? And again, the more criteria you include, the smaller your population will be. Okay, now let's look at what a sample is. Right? Oh, I'm sorry, just kidding. We are going to look at pros and cons of a small and large population. And then we're going to look at a sample and what that means. I only have one screen. I don't have dual screen, so I sometimes forget what I'm talking about next. So I apologize for that. All right, a small population. What's good about it? Well, first of all, if your population is really, really small, maybe you can actually test everybody in it. All right, and if it is possible to test everybody in this really, really small population, then you will know truths about the population. There will be no probabilities. You will know absolutes, absolute truth. This is true because I tested everybody in the entire population. But again, if your population is immense, good luck testing everybody, right? So the smaller the population, generally speaking, the more likely it is that you're going to actually be able to test everybody in that population. Now, the second advantage, or the second good thing about a small population, is that it doesn't always, but it can be easier to get a representative sample from it. All right, so if you do need to sample from your population, if that population is relatively small, chances are we can get a relatively small sample and it still be a pretty good sample. Now, that's not a guarantee. That's why I say it can be easier. It's not always going to be easier. All right. Okay, so those are the advantages, all right, the pros of having a small population. The con, the disadvantage, is that if you have a very small population, that means it's been very narrowly defined. So your study will only apply to a very small group of individuals or animals or plants or whatever it is you're studying, right? So if your population is very narrowly defined, your results, the results of your study, can only or will only apply to that very small population. Now, it might apply to others, but you don't know that because you can only make conclusions based on the population that you defined. All right. So if I come up with results from a study on human postmenopausal women who have never been pregnant, all I can say from my results is that this is what I if you got the whole population, this is what I know about women postmenopausal, never been pregnant. All right, I'm not going to be able to take those results and generalize to members outside that population, not with any confidence. All right. Okay. What about a large population? And pros and cons. And they're kind of just a flip-flop of what we just said. So if you have a very large population, then it's going to be very unlikely that you're going to be able to test everybody in that population. Unless you can test everybody, then you will not know truths about the population. You can estimate probabilities. This is, probably this or probably that, but you can't know truths. Remember, to know truths, you have to test everybody in the population. All right? So if it's very, very large, chances are you're going to have to sample from that population. The second, and now this is a disadvantage, right? So first disadvantage is that you're probably not going to be able to test everybody. You're going to have to sample. And the second disadvantage is that it can be harder to get a representative sample from it. If you've got a very, very, very large population, chances are there's a lot of diversity in that population. And if there's a lot of diversity in that population, it may be hard to get a sample that is representative, a good reflection of the population. We're going to go into more detail about what we mean by representative in just a minute. All right. But again, if it's very large population, chances are it's going to be very diverse, and that makes it oftentimes harder to get a representative sample. All right. But just like before, we're saying it can be harder. It's not always going to be harder. All right. What about a pro? What is a good thing about having a very large population? Well, if you've got that very large population, remember I said these tend to be more diverse. You've got a lot of diversity in a very, very large population. And so if you are collecting data from that population, if you're sampling and taking data from the sample, you're going to be able to generalize to more people. Your research findings are going to apply to more than just, for example, women postmenopausal, never been pregnant, etc. All right? And that's always nice to be able to do a study and say this applies to a whole range of people, rather than I did a research study and it only applies to a handful of people. All right? We don't get excited so much about that.